Thanks for the introduction, Kathy, and particularly for the opportunity to give this overview of the kinds of science that's supported in the Low Vision and Blindness Rehabilitation Program. And what I want to start with is the newly updated NEI mission. And I want to highlight the attention to the importance of improving quality of life and expanding opportunities for people who are blind or have low vision. Because that call is for over 300 million global citizens who have lost or are losing their vision, for which there is no treatment. So for them, interventions that can help maximize function and independence are key. So as you can see in the pictures here on the slide, the ability to independently navigate the public transportation system or shop for groceries, the ability to engage in outdoor activities that can improve one's physical health, the opportunity to engage in socializing through team sports or public gatherings, and have access to educational resources and enriching activities. These are all the overall goals of rehabilitation efforts. Now, who the rehabilitation for is also an important consideration. So the term visual impairment covers a wide range of vision loss. So from complete absence of light perception to someone who has some residual vision, but the lost vision is not correctable. And importantly, it interferes with daily activities. We refer to this as low vision. Now, whether the person has been blind since birth or is losing their vision either as a child or in older years, that can drastically impact the person's needs and their adaptation to rehabilitation. And then different etiologies. So if they're ocular, cortical, or different disease states, they can all result in qualitatively different experience for the individual. So as you could see on the exemplars at the bottom of this slide. So given that general introduction, let me dive into the work that's supported in this program. And that can be described as basically three different genres of research. About 37% of the grants can be categorized as basic science. Some of it is to understand the behavioral and perceptual ramifications of the disorder, so using psychophysics or other investigative strategies, as well as research to understand the neural systems that are impacted by vision impairment. And I want to point out the motivation for supporting basic science work here in this program is that a better understanding of those behavioral and neural mechanisms is really essential to developing the next generation of therapeutic interventions. About 34% of the grants are more applied or translational science, and that can be either developing and testing new assessments or creating and testing interventions that will enhance residual vision or restore a person's activities of daily living function. And finally, about 29% of the grants are in technology development. So some of that is towards designing new accessibility devices, as well as some early stage technologies that have potential for addressing rehabilitation needs. And so I realize that's a pretty quick overview. The rest of the presentation is going to describe these areas in a bit more detail. So starting with the types of basic behavioral science supported. First, there are a number of adaptations that people with visual impairment just naturally adopt. So for instance, individuals with macular damage experience a loss of their central visual field. But many spontaneously develop a new locus of fixation in intact retina. That's referred to as their preferred retinal locus. Individuals who are blind also naturally adapt through sensory substitution. So many show enhanced capabilities in auditory and tactile processing. So for instance, blind individuals can generally outperform their sighted counterparts in auditory motion discrimination. So in both of the cases that I just described, the adaptations simply evolve. But basic behavioral researchers are systematically probing the constraints and the strategies that people use, and those can be harnessed to inform rehabilitation efforts to enhance those types of adaptations. A very active area of research has been in perceptual learning. What that means is how our perceptual processes are refined through visual experience. The work on perceptual learning involves very carefully controlled experimental studies where a feature of interest is selected and then the person is trained over an extended time period, and their sensitivity to that feature can be tracked over time. So for instance, on the slide, you can see an example of the type of stimuli that have been used to train motion perception learning, where repeated exposure can result in increased sensitivity to the speed or the direction of dots moving on a screen. And there's a very, very rich literature probing the behavioral changes that underlie this learning in normal vision. But research in my portfolio has extended this to understand the limits as well as the potential for perceptual learning in individuals with different types of visual impairments. There's also basic work being done to understand real world behaviors in more naturalistic settings. So for example, on the slide, you could see a driver with macular degeneration or hemianopia who can be tested in a driving simulator to examine pedestrian detection. It's really important to note, because I don't think people are necessarily aware of this, but in many regions, these patients are legally allowed to drive as long as their visual acuity meets the requirement for a restricted license. So it's a very important issue where scientific data could inform public health policy. As I mentioned, the portfolio also supports basic human neuroscience work, where advances in neuroimaging have provided unprecedented opportunities for researchers to understand the neural systems impacted by visual impairment. The portfolio includes work using a variety of methods, so including electroencephalography, magnetoencephalography, and then, of course, functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. And the neuroimaging example that I've provided here on the slide represents one of the trans-NIH Human Connectome Project data collections that we supported. Just as background for those of you who aren't familiar with HCP, that was a large-scale initiative to map out the neural connections in human brains in vivo. Our NEI project examined the neural networks in patients with macular degeneration. And in order to get the cortical connectivity data, the project mapped retinal lesions to the cortex to get really precise estimates of plasticity in the adult human brain. An important aspect of this data collection is that all connectome data are harmonized with other connectome studies, and they are made publicly available through a central data repository. So this allows broad access to other researchers to be able to make comparisons with, for instance, this data set with the other data sets in individuals with intact vision. The second general category of research supported is more applied, or translational science. And included in that is the important work on developing new assessments that go beyond the standard acuity, contrast sensitivity, and Humphrey perimetry measures. Many patients who show intact performance on these measures cannot process a visual scene. So ecologically valid assessments that evaluate real world function and dysfunction can provide a fuller picture of the patient's experience and can pinpoint areas that require rehabilitation. In addition, there's work addressing the need for specialized assessments for patients with ultra low vision, prosthetic recipients, and non-ocular visual impairment. So, for example, the figure on the right comes from Lotfi Marabet's lab. And as part of a general research effort, he's developed assessments of the spatial processing deficits that are seen in kids with cortical visual impairment. The assessment that he devised harnesses virtual reality to create simulations that are more comparable to the kinds of visual environments that are challenging for these kids with CVI. So, for example, being asked to find a toy in a crowded toy box. And the other grouping of translational science that's supported in this program includes development and evaluation of visual interventions. Ongoing projects in the portfolio include the use of telerehabilitation and virtual reality to deliver visual rehabilitation, and the use of sensory substitution to enhance non-visual function. So, for example, training echolocation to blind individuals to navigate through sound. Now, I mentioned perceptual learning earlier as some of the basic science that's supported in this program. It has also been brought into clinics to test to what degree it can be used as an intervention. And the example shown on the right of this slide comes from Crystal Huxton's lab, who has been exploring to what degree perceptual learning can address vision loss after occipital stroke. So she has adapted some of the established perceptual discrimination paradigms, as shown along the top of the figure, and projects them at the edge and then into the patient's perimetry-defined cortically blind field. And the work has demonstrated that visual training can recover normal threshold levels of discrimination and awareness in the trained regions of cortically blind fields. The extent of the recovery possible and the mechanisms underlying it continue to be investigated, but the general findings are really exciting and encouraging. So the third category of research in this portfolio, or technology development, mainly focuses on accessibility devices for the visually impaired. A very fruitful area has been the involvement of computer scientists in developing iPhone apps that can help in navigation, object recognition, and reading text. So as an example of this area, the figure on the right is from ongoing work by our council member, James Coughlin. He's been developing an indoor navigation assistance system called iNavigate that can estimate the user's location indoors and then guide him or her to a particular destination. The device can work on a standard smartphone after downloading a 2D map that includes locations of signs. And as the mover moves through space, the phone can detect the signs and then issues auditory turn-by-turn directions. You can see that the device is really built for real-world use. So in other words, a user who is blind and holding their phone may not necessarily have the phone in exactly the right position for everything to be vertical and horizontal, as the camera might expect. And so what the system actually can do is take those images, using information from the phone, can unroll them to the point where those signs can actually be identified. And because iPhones are ubiquitous, the development of the apps in general holds a lot of promise for wide adoption. There's other types of accessibility devices that are also being developed with NEI support. Engineering efforts have resulted in the development and refinement of expansion prisms for individuals with hemianopia. The prisms direct images from the blind spot to the functioning visual field, and then they serve to expand the patient's field of view. And then there's also some exciting work that's come through NEI's participation in the Trans-Agency National Robotics Initiative, through which we've been able to support the development of co-robotic canes and gloves that provide additional tactile and auditory guidance to the device user. So as I noted in the earlier slide, most of the technology development that's represented in my portfolio is devoted to creating accessibility devices that use a particular strategy to target a particular activity. But there's also some work coming in that focuses on new technologies that have potential for use. So for instance, material sciences have pushed the boundaries on what sort of information can be conveyed by touch. Most existing options to convey tactile information to the blind are limited to lines or bumps. So Braille, for instance, relies on raised dots. These aids just don't convey as much information as typical visual graphics. So there's definitely room for improvement. Cutting edge engineering science has been developing coatings made from designer materials to control friction and adhesion, which could generate a wider variety of tactile sensations that have the potential to be used by tactile aid designers. And in addition, software and hardware advances in virtual reality, so for instance, including eye trackers, developing smaller and lighter weight display technologies, augmented reality, optical coherence reading methods. These are all being integrated, and in some projects, integrated with the goal of being used in vision rehabilitation. So we're seeing a number of encouraging trends that could lead to future directions in the program that I want to highlight on this last slide. First of all, I presented initially 3 different categories of science that are supported by this program, but that line is really getting harder to draw. Basic science is being exported to applied settings and often within the same project. I'm sure you picked up on that with the visual perception learning example that I described. But we also see basic science informing prototype developments as they're being developed. That blurred line can also be seen with technology development, which has been impacting assessments and rehabilitation strategies. So as technology advances and more that can be done, that allows for new questions and opportunities for investigators to take advantage of as they consider what can be done in applied settings. And another encouraging trend is that the collaborations across many fields are really making the research and technologies better. I refer on the slide to the collaboration as pre-hoc because they're not post-hoc. So the teams are working together from the start, and instead of having engineers developing a device that doesn't really fit the need and actually has to be sort of retrofit, we see integration at the beginning. So important input from vision scientists, rehab specialists, and crucially, people with lived experience. They are there at the starting blocks in these device developments. Finally, and as we just had a discussion about, data and technology access is exploding. So data such as the Connectome neuroimaging data sets that I mentioned earlier, and code developed for devices and software, more and more are publicly available. So that's really allowing that original development to be more impactful. With that, I just thank you very much for your attention.